Picture a conference room in Beijing. It is Monday morning, January 19th, 2026. China's National Bureau of Statistics is about to release fourth quarter gross domestic product data. Economists around the world are watching this development. Investors are watching, policymakers are watching, chief executive officers of multinational corporations are also watching. The number appears as 4.5% growth. Trading Economics reported this in January 2026. On paper, this sounds fine and respectable. Most developed countries would celebrate 4.5% growth. However, the headline does not tell the full story. This is China's weakest quarterly growth in 3 years. Reuters reported this in January 2026. China spent 3 decades growing at 10% annually. This growth lifted 800 million people out of poverty. It relied on explosive economic expansion. Therefore, 4.5% is not just a number, it is a warning sign. Welcome to the new reality of the world's second largest economy. The government hit its annual 5% growth target for 2025. The National Bureau of Statistics reported this in January 2026, yet nobody is celebrating. Underneath that headline number, something is breaking, and the cracks are starting to show. Let us rewind. Understanding where China is now requires understanding where it has been. For 30 years, from 1981 to 2011, China's economy grew at an average annual rate of 10.2%. Advisor Perspectives reported this in 2013. This meant 10% growth every single year for 3 decades. Think about that. In the 2000s alone, China averaged 10.3% annual growth. Econovisuals reported this in 2025. In some years, like 2007, growth hit 14%. The entire Chinese economy doubled in size roughly every 7 years. No country in modern history had ever sustained that kind of growth for that long. The San Francisco Federal Reserve reported this in 2015. It was called the Chinese Miracle, and it was miraculous. In 1990, China's gross domestic product was $361 billion. By 2010, it was $6.1 trillion. By 2020, this reached $14.7 trillion. The country built more infrastructure in 20 years than the United States built in 1 century. Entire cities appeared overnight. Hundreds of millions of people moved from rural poverty to the urban middle class. Shanghai transformed from a manufacturing hub into a gleaming financial capital with a skyline that rivals New York. Shenzhen went from a fishing village to a technology megacity in 1 generation. High-speed rail networks connected cities hundreds of miles apart. New highways, airports, and skyscrapers were built. The speed was intoxicating. The scale was unprecedented. And the world watched in awe. But here's the thing about miracles. They do not last forever. Fast forward to today, January 2026. China just reported full year 2025 gross domestic product growth of 5.0%. This technically hit Beijing's around 5% target. Cable News Network reported this in January 2026. However, looking closer reveals a different story. Fourth quarter. 2025 growth was just 4.5% year on year. This was down from 4.8% in the third quarter. Trading Economics reported this in January 2026. The economy is slowing quarter after quarter. Here is a significant point. Retail sales, the measure of what Chinese people are actually buying, grew just 0.9% in December 2025. The Consumer News and Business Channel reported this in January 2026. That was the slowest gain since China lifted its brutal zero COVID lockdowns in late 2022. Al Jazeera reported this in January 2026. For the full year, retail sales grew only 3.7%. This was down from 4% in 2024. Columbia Broadcasting System 19 reported this in January 2026. Translation: Chinese consumers are not spending. There's a woman in Shanghai named Li Wei. She is 32 years old and works in marketing. She makes 280,000 yuan a year. This is about $39,000. This salary places her in the upper middle class by Chinese standards. 3 years ago, she would go shopping every weekend. She bought new clothes and ate at nice restaurants. She took weekend trips to Hangzhou or Suzhou. She also bought her first car, a domestic brand, proud to support Chinese manufacturing. She was saving for an apartment down payment. She was planning her wedding and dreaming about starting a family. Today, her habits have changed. She packs lunch from home. She takes the subway instead of using DiDi services. She canceled her gym membership. She stopped buying new clothes, shopping on secondhand applications instead. She also put off her wedding indefinitely. Now, she puts 40% of her salary into savings. Her apartment is still renting. The down payment she saved is no longer enough. Prices dropped in some neighborhoods, but banks tightened lending. Her parents offered to help, but she refused their offer. They need their savings for retirement, and she is not sure her job is stable enough. When I asked her why, she expressed a chilling concern. She did not know if her job would exist next year. She was unsure if the economy would worsen. Her company laid off 15% of staff last quarter. Her manager indicated more cuts were coming. Therefore, she was saving everything, just in case. Multiply leeway by 1.4 billion. That is your problem. So what happened? How did the world's growth engine sputter? 3 massive crises hit at once. Beijing is struggling to fix any of them. The first crisis is the property apocalypse. Do you remember Evergrande? This real estate giant had over $300 billion in debt. Cable News Network reported this in August 2025. It collapsed and was liquidated by a Hong Kong court in January 2024. Wikipedia reported this in 2026. Then Country Garden, China's biggest property developer, defaulted on $17.7 billion in offshore debt. Law Asia reported this in December 2025. Then Sunak followed. Shimao also defaulted. Dozens more companies suffered the same fate. 8 of China's 30 major builders that defaulted have now received liquidation orders. Bloomberg reported this in October 2025. These were not fringe companies. These were the pillars of China's economy. They were the giants that built the cities. They employed millions of people. They represented the Chinese dream made concrete. Here is why it matters. For 20 years, real estate comprised 25 to 30% of China's entire gross domestic product. Local governments funded themselves by selling land to developers. Middle-class families put 70% of their wealth into apartments. Construction drove demand for steel, cement, glass, and copper. In short, it drove demand for everything. Then it all stopped. In the 2000s, China's real estate sector grew 10.7% annually. By the 2010s, that slowed to 5.11%. Bruegel reported this in February 2025. By 2025, the sector is shrinking. There's a guy in Shenzhen named Chen. He is 38 years old and a software engineer at a technology company. He bought an apartment in 2021 for 6 million yuan. This sum represented his life savings, plus loans from both sets of parents, plus a massive mortgage. It was a 30-year loan at 5.2% interest. Today, that apartment is worth maybe 4.2 million yuan on a good day. He is underwater by 1.8 million yuan. This represents $250,000 in losses. All of this happened in just 4 years. He is still paying the mortgage, 18,000 yuan a month. This is for an asset that is losing value every quarter. His salary stagnates and his company hints at layoffs. The apartment next door is empty. An investor bought it in 2019. Now, this investor is trying to sell it at any price, but there are no takers. 3 floors up, another unit remains unfinished. The developer ran out of money. Only concrete and rebar are left, exposed to the elements. Chen is not buying anything. He's not upgrading his car. He's not having kids, as he and his wife decided they cannot afford it. He's not taking risks. He's not switching jobs. He is not investing. He is not dreaming. He is surviving. And there are millions like him. Millions of families are watching their wealth evaporate. Millions of apartments are unfinished. Millions are in debt with no way out. Do you know what that does to an economy? It freezes it. The second crisis is the debt time bomb. China's total debt, including government, corporate, and household, exceeded 300% of gross domestic product. This was as of June 2025. The Dallas Federal Reserve reported this in December 2025. That is 3 times the entire economy. Local governments alone have about 10.5 trillion yuan in hidden debt. These are off-the-books liabilities from decades of reckless infrastructure spending. Gov.cn reported this in September 2025. Here's how that happened. For years, local officials in China were judged on one metric: gross domestic product growth. If you wanted a promotion, you had to grow your city's economy. So they borrowed money. They built stadiums and convention centers. They created industrial parks and high-speed rail lines to nowhere. They created shadow financing vehicles, basically fake companies. These allowed them to borrow money without it showing up on official books. The strategy was to build first and worry about repayment later. Except now it is later, and the bills are due. Beijing launched a 10 trillion yuan bailout. This amounted to $1.39 trillion to refinance some of this debt. The Atlantic Council reported this in July 2025. However, economists say it is not enough. It is like putting a small bandage on a gunshot wound. Some experts argue China needs a 30 trillion yuan debt swap. This would be over $4 trillion just to stabilize things. The South China Morning Post reported this in July 2025. Consider this fact. That amount is about 1/3 of China's entire gross domestic product. This huge sum is just to clean up the mess from past decisions. Do you know what debt on that scale does? It crushes growth. Every yuan spent servicing old debt is a yuan not spent on new investment, infrastructure, or consumption. It is like running on a treadmill while carrying a backpack full of bricks. You are burning energy, but you are not going anywhere. The third crisis is that nobody is hiring. Youth unemployment in China for people aged 16 to 24 hit 21.3% in June 2023. Statista reported this in January 2026. It became so bad that Beijing stopped publishing the data for months. When they started reporting again with a new methodology, conveniently excluding students, the rate was still 16.9% in November 2025. Reuters reported this in December 2025. 1 in 6 young Chinese people cannot find work. There is a term that went viral in China, Tang, which means lying flat. It describes young people who have given up on the hustle. They cannot afford homes, cannot find stable jobs, and do not see a future. Consequently, they just stop trying. They work the bare minimum. Many live with their parents. They reject the 9-9-6 culture, which means working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. This culture dominated technology companies. These young people simply opt out. A 26-year-old college graduate in Hangzhou, let us call him Zhong, told a reporter about his parents' generation. They believed hard work brought prosperity. His father worked in a factory, saved money, bought an apartment, and sent Zhong to university. Zhong's father believed in the system. Zhong then spoke about his own situation. He has a bachelor's degree from a good university. He works 60 hours a week in customer service for an e-commerce company. He makes 6,000 yuan a month, which is about $850. He cannot afford rent in his own city. He lives with 3 roommates in a 50-square-meter apartment, an hour from work. His parents ask when he will get married, buy a home, and have kids. He laughs, asking with what money. He questions the point of trying harder. That is not economic data. That is social collapse. And this is spreading. The lying flat movement continues to grow. There is also a rejection of marriage, as China's marriage rate hit a record low in 2025. The birth rate is also at a record low. China's population is now shrinking. Cable News Network reported this in January 2026. You cannot have economic growth without population growth, not sustainably, and China's demographic clock is ticking. But wait, here's where it gets really weird. While China's domestic economy is struggling, its exports are booming. In 2025, China recorded a $1.19 trillion trade surplus. This was the largest in world history. Reuters reported this in January 2026. Exports grew 5.5% while imports stayed flat. The Consumer News and Business Channel reported this in January 2026. December 2025 alone saw a $114 billion trade surplus. Cable News Network reported this in January 2026. This was achieved in just 1 month. Translation: China is selling tons of stuff to the world, but buying nothing back. That sounds good, right? It suggests an export powerhouse. It signals a trade surplus. It also indicates manufacturing dominance. Except it is not. It is actually a symptom of the disease. Consider this point. When your own citizens will not spend money, your companies must sell abroad just to survive. Chinese factories are producing at full capacity. They make electric vehicles, solar panels, electronics, and machinery. However, this production is for foreign markets, not domestic ones. Industrial production grew 5.9% in 2025. The National Bureau of Statistics reported this in January 2026. Factories are humming with activity. Yet, retail sales only grew 3.7%. That is like having a massive engine producing tons of energy, but the car is not moving. The engine is running hot and burning fuel. However, there is no one in the driver's seat. And here's the problem. The world is noticing, and they are angry. Former President Trump slapped tariffs on Chinese goods during his campaign. Now he is back in office and threatening more. Reuters reported this in January 2026. The European Union is investigating Chinese subsidies for electric vehicles and solar panels. Countries across Southeast Asia and Latin America are complaining about Chinese products. These products are flooding their markets and killing local industries. Brazil's steel industry has been decimated by cheap Chinese imports. Mexico's solar manufacturers cannot compete. Vietnam's electronics sector is struggling. China's export boom is not sustainable. It is creating global tensions that will eventually blow back. When other countries start blocking Chinese goods, that growth will go nowhere. Now, let us talk about the elephant in the room. Is China's data even real? Here is something nobody wants to say out loud. Beijing has a history of adjusting economic numbers. In 2023, youth unemployment hit 21.3%. Beijing responded by changing how they calculate it. They excluded students. They also changed the age range. Furthermore, they adjusted the methodology. Suddenly, the official number looked better according to the Asia Society in September 2025. When local gross domestic product numbers do not add up to national totals, provincial officials quietly revise them upward to hit targets. In China's political system, missing growth targets can end careers. Therefore, the incentive is to manipulate numbers. There is a famous story about Keqiang, the former premier. He once said he did not trust China's gross domestic product data. He used his own index, which included electricity consumption, rail cargo volume, and bank lending. According to Wikiquote in 2007, those numbers were harder to fake. When Beijing announces 5.0% growth for 2025, some economists remain skeptical. Independent estimates from the World Bank suggest growth might be closer to from 4.5% to 4.9%. This was reported by the World Bank in December 2025. It is not a huge difference, however it matters. If the official numbers are this bad, the real numbers might be worse. Some analysts think actual growth could be as low as from 3% to 4%. That would put China in dangerous territory. There would not be enough growth to service debt, create jobs, or maintain stability. So where does this end? Option 1 describes China pulling off a miracle again. Beijing unleashes massive stimulus. This includes trillions in government spending, aggressive monetary policy, and structural reforms to boost consumption. The property market stabilizes. Consumers start spending. Confidence returns. Growth then rebounds from 6% to 7%. Is this possible? Certainly, China has done it before. After the 2008 financial crisis, Beijing launched a 4 trillion yuan stimulus. This kept growth above 8%, but this time it is different. The problems are not cyclical, they are structural. It is not a temporary slowdown. Instead, it is a fundamental shift in how the economy works. Option 2 is Japan's lost decades. In the 1980s, Japan was where China is now. It was an unstoppable economic juggernaut and a rising superpower. Then its property bubble burst. Debt exploded, banks collapsed, growth stalled. Japan spent the next 30 years growing at from 1% to 2% annually. A generation was lost to stagnation. There was deflation. Zombie companies were kept alive by cheap credit. Young people had no prospects. Could China follow that path? Absolutely. Some economists see eerie parallels, according to Bruegel in February 2025. China faces a property bubble, an aging population, and massive debt. There is also falling consumer confidence. What is the difference? Japan was rich when it stagnated. Its per capita income was already high. However, China is still a developing country in many regions. Stagnation now would trap hundreds of millions in middle-income status forever. Option 3 is that something breaks. The property crisis spirals out of control. Major banks collapse. Social unrest erupts with protests, strikes, and riots. Beijing cracks down with force. Capital flees the country. Foreign investors pull out. The economy contracts sharply. This is the nightmare scenario, a hard landing. China's economy shrinks from 2% to 3% instead of growing. Unemployment spikes from 15% to 20%. The political system destabilizes. Nobody wants this scenario. Not China and not the West. A collapsing China would drag down the entire global economy. It would be 10 times worse than 2008, but it is possible. The probability is low, but not zero. Option 4, and this is what I think is most likely, is that China muddles through. Growth stays in the range of from 4% to 5% for years. It is not a disaster. It is not a boom. It is just a slow deflation of expectations. The Chinese dream shrinks. The focus shifts from getting rich to staying employed. It moves from buying a home to affording rent. The idea that anything is possible changes to a focus on keeping one's head down. The government manages this decline. It uses censorship and control to prevent unrest. It also pumps just enough stimulus to avoid collapse. The government lets growth slow gradually rather than crash suddenly. That is not collapse. However, it is not prosperity either. It is managed decline. It is a slow fade from miracle to mediocrity. Here is why this matters to you, wherever you are. China is 17% of global gross domestic product. It is the world's largest manufacturer. It is also the biggest exporter and the second largest consumer market. Its economic slowdown ripples everywhere. Slower Chinese growth means less demand for commodities. This is bad news for Australia's iron ore, Brazil's soybeans, and Africa's copper. It means Chinese companies are dumping cheap products globally to survive. This threatens industries from Mexico to Vietnam to Europe. It also means geopolitical tension as Beijing tries to distract from economic problems with nationalist rhetoric. This could involve Taiwan, the South China Sea, and trade wars. And it means the end of an era. For 3 decades, China was the growth story. It was the place where fortunes were made. It was also where global companies flocked and where the future was being built. Executives would visit Shanghai and Beijing and come back awestruck. They spoke of the energy and the optimism. There was a strong sense that anything was possible. What about now? Li Wei is packing lunch. Chen is underwater on his mortgage. Zhong, the college graduate, is lying flat. Young people are not getting married or having children. Consumers are hoarding cash instead of spending. And 4.5% growth, once unthinkable for China, is the new normal. Perhaps it is even optimistic. Let me leave you with one last thought. There is a phrase Chinese officials use, which is high-quality growth. They say China is transitioning from high-speed growth to high-quality growth. This implies more sustainable and balanced development. It also means a greater focus on consumption rather than investment. It is a nice way of saying that they cannot grow at 10% anymore. Therefore, they are changing the definition of success. And maybe that is fine. Perhaps 5% growth for an $18 trillion economy is impressive. Maybe China is finding a new equilibrium. It is moving from a developing nation to a developed nation. It is also moving from a manufacturing powerhouse to a service economy. Perhaps 4.5% is the new miracle. But tell that to Li Wei, tell that to Chen, tell that to Zhong, who was lying flat because the ladder to prosperity disappeared. Growth is not just a number on a spreadsheet. It is jobs. It is hope. It is the belief that tomorrow will be better than today. It is also the belief that your children will live better than you did. And when growth slows from 10% to 4.5%, when retail sales hit 0.9% and youth unemployment stays above 16%, that is not just an economic shift. That is a generation losing faith. China hit its 5% target for 2025. Xi Jinping declared success. State media celebrated. The Communist Party congratulated itself on steering the economy through turbulent times. But on the streets of Shanghai and Shenzhen, nobody is celebrating. There is no celebration in the unfinished apartment towers. There is no celebration in the crowded subways. There is no celebration in the offices where layoffs loom. The 4.5% reality feels a lot like decline. And the scary part is that this might be as good as it gets. If you found this story fascinating or terrifying, please share it. China's slowdown is one of the biggest economic stories of our time. It will reshape global trade, geopolitics, and your own economic future. And most people have no idea it is happening. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.